And we're still here. My computer did it. No, seriously, that's a problem with it because I've run Linux full time, and every now and then, if you start something like a screen recording or something, everything locks up. It's really annoying. So, welcome everyone, and I am going. Oh yeah, I need to actually. This is going to be fun. Let me move this over here, and I'm going to do a screen share. Let me close all the extraneous tabs and share my entire 1080p screen, which is my secondary monitor, but it's the one that's slightly more fair to share because when you have a 4K monitor, it's just not cool to be like, here's my full screen. It's like, I can't read size 4 print. Um, So, my name is Frank Rietta, and I'm so glad to have you all here today. So, this is going to be a very um, kind of from my own experience, something I've done. I am I've been using Unix of various kinds since the 90s, Linux, FreeBSD. Um, if I have to, and I run Linux full time on my desktop, and I have a Linux laptop. I do have a Mac still. I don't use it as much. All these things apply there as well. So I pretty much live with a browser and multiple terminals opened is pretty much how I do my work. And I might every now and then kind of maybe I've gotten a little lazy in my old age and have agreed to use Visual Studio Code a little bit more. But most of my screenshot examples are in Vim because I want to show how old school I am as a way of posturing with y'all so you think I'm cool still. At least it's cool enough to use Vim. I can use Emacs, but I always forget how to exit it, which is probably pretty ironic considering I'm pretty comfortable in Vim, and usually people complain about like I don't know how to exit Vim. um, but a couple of tricks for how I keep custom programs at my fingertips whenever I'm in the terminal, and how you can write these in Ruby. I am pretty comfortable writing up Bash scripts, but anything that's more than super simple, like checking if a file exists, and then doing this or that, I tend to reach to Ruby instead for my own personal shell scripting needs. So this is a little different than your standard Rails thing, but Ruby's been used in this capacity for a long time. So some things I want to briefly cover today. What makes a good command line application? Just we're going to talk about that for a minute. Why some personal command line apps, and then I'm going to show you a bunch of examples to kind of whet your appetite for what you can do, but we're only going to scratch the surface, and then talk about like ideas that you might have, stuff you could do on your own. So one of the things to start out with is the Unix philosophy, and the Wikipedia page is actually pretty good about this. So that's where I grabbed that picture, of course. And you can see the part I put in the slide was this one, the summarization. But when it, write programs that do one thing and does it well, right? You've seen this before, right? In other platforms, you end up with these monolithic applications that do everything, too much stuff. In Unix, you tend to have small programs that do a specific thing. They're composable. They work well together. So you'll take the output of one and pipe it into the next one. This is why you can do things like grep and then sort and then unique and then awk or whatever you want to do. And you can like all of a sudden be this like magical person ripping apart log files, and you're just typing a few commands. And it's just because the power of these composable small programs lets you do that. And then the third point kind of falls into what I just said: write programs to handle text streams, because that's the universal interface. So on Unix, with a Unix pipe, pretty much all input and output is reading from standard in or writing to standard out. And in this talk, I'm going to show you how to make Ruby programs that either read from standard in or standard or a file, depending on a parameter that's passed into them. Ruby makes a great command line interface language. It's widely distributed by default in FreeBSD, Mac OS, and even many Linuxes. And the times that it is for some reason not just there by default, it's usually one command away to get it onto a fresh installed system, especially with package stuff, so it's readily available. It works on the Raspberry Pi. It works on my fastest computers. It's everywhere. So a bunch of really powerful tools, including the FreeBSD portage for the ports collection, and the Metasploit security testing framework are all written in Ruby. So if you want to get into pen testing with Metasploit and be ahead of all the Pythonistas in the InfoSec space, you speak the native language of Metasploit. So that should give you a leg up. And then pretty much all the Debians have it, including Raspbian, which it runs on the Raspberry Pi. And then you can type which Ruby to find out where it's located, and Ruby-V to find out which version it is. And so here's an example on Kali Linux. Fired it up in a virtual machine just to show that, yes, it does have Ruby. One thing I'll point out, when you're doing command line stuff like this, it does help to try to stay away. I know as Ruby developers, we often have a Ruby switcher like ASDF or RBIM or something, because we're going to use the latest and the greatest. When you're doing general shell scripting, it does make some sense to stick with features that are available in the system Ruby of the computer, the distribution you're working with. So, for example, if I'm writing a script that's helpful, and I upload it to, say, a Linux server or something we're doing, if it's not Ruby development, it's just a shell script, it's nice to not have to do all this fancy stuff to get a Ruby that will interpret it. So I try to be backwards compatible and only use features that are supported by whatever ancient Ruby that the system has, which is usually only a couple years old at worst. So it's not really been a big roadblock. You can fire up IRB. If you've gem installed Pry, you can also fire up Pry, which is helpful. So one of the first things, if you're used to using Ruby with like Rails or Sinatra, one of these big frameworks loaded, is you'll kind of have this uncanny valley of stuff you thought was part of Ruby is just not there all of a sudden. So you're like, puts 2 + 2 = 4. Great, that part worked. And then you're like, time.now. Oh, okay, that worked. And then you're like, time.now + 2 days. And it's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Days on integer. And that's because that method that everyone talks about being so cool is really part of Ruby on Rails, not just plain Ruby. But if it's something that you really want, you can get it because there's a gem for it, and you don't have to include all of the gems from Rails to install some of the gems from Rails. So you could do or require active support -all or find the specific one, and now your plain Ruby plus this active support will do this time.now + 2 days just fine. So you can bring in libraries that from bigger frameworks into your code. Now, one thing to point out though, if you're writing a shell script and the gem is not available, it's just going to blow up. So, and then you might have to say, oh, gem install this unless you want to use bundler. So, a lot of times it is helpful to intentionally try to do what you need, sticking to as much of the basic Ruby as you possibly can. And that makes your shell script just work without a bunch of external dependencies. So, so how can we write a script? So this is the only screenshot of Visual Studio Code, just to prove I know how to open it. Not that I needed to prove that. And so, yeah, you just do a script like anything else. One thing that may look unfamiliar if you've not done a bunch of shell scripting is the very first line of the file is called the shebang line. And so it's hash and the exclamation point, and then the path to an interpreter. And oftentimes these are like user/bin/sh for shell scripts or bash. But in all Unixes, you can do user bin/env space and then the interpreter that you want this thing to be used by. What I like about this is that this is compatible with Linux. This is compatible with Mac OS. This is compatible with FreeBSD. But if you do /user/bin/wherever Ruby's located, and that's not where it's located on FreeBSD, for example, your script won't work, and someone would have to edit the shebang line to get this to work seamlessly. So this is the most seamless way to do it, is this approach of using user bin env, and then what you want. The other benefit is if you are using rbinv or one of those switchers, this way will then have it use your chosen version of Ruby as the interpreter rather than defaulting to whatever the system Ruby is because you referenced its full path. So this is just kind of a line you throw at the top of all your files and go from there. So then the next thing is to you don't need the .rb. So especially if this is going to be a command that you run, you want to leave that off if you don't want to type it every time. If you want to just act like a native tool, you do need to change the permission to 755, which sets the execute bit on the script, which tells the shell interpreter that this is executable, and the shell interpreter uses the shebang line to then load up the next the program that interprets it. I left this off here, but if you wanted to, so for example, I have some things here. I could type Ruby hello. I could type sh hello. Well, is that true? That is interesting that didn't work. I can do --hello. So it can be invoked several different ways. But that is how that works. So here's the next tip. So on all my home folders, I have a folder called bin, bin. It's my own bin stubs directory, basically. And in that bin directory, I put various tools that I've built up over time. Some of them are Ruby, some of them are just Bash. They just do random stuff that helps me be fast at my work. Win31's interesting. That actually starts up a virtual machine with Windows 3.11 in it, because that's really cool flex to show off when someone doesn't think you can do that. GPG tar, I've done stuff. That's probably it basically just does a GPG compression, but it uses parallel gzip. So I just have tools I've built up over time. Some growl, I think that's a Mac thing. I probably should delete that file because that's no longer relevant to anything I'm doing. And then I'll throw together a lot of stuff. So I just have a junk drawer of these things, but I can type any of these commands from any place because I've added my bin stub directory to my custom path in my bash shell here. I still use bash. I know ZSH is fashionable, but bash has been great for me for 21 years. I'm a pretty loyal person. I try not to turn my back on solid technology just because some Apple person said that ZSH was cooler. I'm like, okay, maybe. And so, yeah, once you do that, add this line. I can be anywhere. So, like, I could be in my temp folder, and I could be like weeks. And it's like, oh, boom. And this is one of my Ruby tools I'm going to show you later. It happens so often that I needed, for like freelancing reasons, to know like what week of the year is this, and like what week is next week. And so I just made this tool, I don't know, 7-8 years ago, and I use it occasionally to get that real fast. It kind of reminds me of the cal command in Unix, which gives you a quick calendar, because why open up your web browser and go to Google Calendar where you can just type cal in your terminal and move on with your life. So, how do you write to standard out and standard error? This is the thing that you definitely need to do. And I'm sorry about my alarm is auto setting and doing that beep. Let me just go set it real quick. I do that so that I don't forget to arm the alarm. But then when I like unplugged everything, apparently the clock is no longer accurate. So like midnight is now like now, which is whatever. Uh, home ownership. Okay. I also have a 1980s intercom doorbell that I actually saved and rerouted. That was a fun project. I used some spare Ethernet cable for my run. So that anyway, off topic. Um, so um, if everyone's familiar with pipes, you can do the greater than or the less than sign. Um, uh, this one where you do left is greater than right, will write to a file. The other way, which is not depicted in the slide, will read from a file and write it to standard in for the program. Pipe also takes from the left-hand side program, takes the output and moves it to the right-hand side as input to the next. And then this to pipe writes errors to a file. So you can do various things. So in Ruby, you can call .puts and .write on these. .puts has a new line character implicit at the end of the output on that string. .write does not add a new line character. So if you want one, you need to add it yourself, or it can also be helpful if you're writing binary and you don't want to add that. You use .write instead. And then here's a script. And so you'll see it has this all caps standard error is an object in Ruby and standard out is an object in Ruby. And you can puts or write on either of them. And so if I go here and type, let's exit this one, outputs. So outputs, because I didn't do anything, you will see both of them. If I do to temp error dot text, what do you think is going to happen when I do this? What are we going to see?
Why am I here? Something is wrong.
No, we're going to see the standard out because we piped standard error to this file. Yeah. And same if we do it the other way, we're going to see why am I here? Something is wrong because we piped standard out to the file. So if you do this, you'll see nothing because we wrote that to that file and that to that file. So that's standard Unix pipe behavior. Any questions there? Oh yeah, so if we do cat, cat is just gonna do stuff. I mean, of course, you probably know you can do that, right? Well, you can also do this. So that reads from a file, and you can do temp.test.txt. So that read from this and wrote to this. So you can mix and match, and that's all coming from Unix. And I think Windows does some of this, maybe kind of. I honestly don't know. I know it's has copied some of this. Any questions on here? So if you're writing out to a file, say you're doing it, and you have an error and you want to write the error output so that then the canonically correct way is not to just call puts, but to call standard error.puts and write the error out to standard error. And then depending on what you want to do, if you actually error it out, you'll want to have an exit command somewhere in your code that returns an error code so that it would stop executing an and sign in Unix. So returning an error code could matter too. So now we've talked about writing. We should talk a little bit about reading command line arguments because, commands that don't take arguments are, not super useful all the time. So the first and easiest way is to know that this argv object in Ruby is the array of arguments. In some other languages, the first argument is the command itself, but in Ruby, the first argument in position 0 is the first parameter. The command itself is not included in the argv array. Um, it is an array. It has all the features of a Ruby array. And so you'll see I wrote this little thing that says how many arguments were passed in, and then argv, and it puts them like that, right? So you could be like argv convert, test this to this, that sort of thing. And so this is really super useful. And I'll go ahead and show you something else here. So clear, if I do argv.b star, you'll see what actually happens is shell expansion. And so in Unix, when you do a star character like that, what's really happening is it is generating a call with 11 arguments, one for each file in the system. This is why for exceedingly large directories, when you're doing argument expansion, you can actually exceed the maximum length of a command line and have an error. And so if you see that in one of your shell scripts, now you know why. The way around that, and I don't have an example of this exactly in this presentation, would be to look up the dir command in Ruby. If you wanted to scan a directory from Ruby code, that would not be subject to, and you could do it recursively, that would not be itself subject to the limits of command line expansion via the star. So this interpretation here, by the way, is not something that a Ruby script is doing. This is something that our shell is doing, and it's invoking. So this is literally the same as this colors ... right? Well, in this case, not. You get what I'm saying. So that's how that works. That's the simple way of grabbing arguments. So now we can go into another example here. So this is a real tool that I use all the time. It's in my bin folder. It turns out when you're freelancing and you're doing stuff and you have different timers, they come up with all sorts of crazy ways of representing time. And one of the easiest ways of billing for time is to have a decimal rounded to 1 decimal point, which is by definition 6 minutes of time. And then you can just easily multiply that by your rate and send your customer an invoice. I've used other trackers that like recorded time to like 5 decimal places, and that annoyed the hell out of me because I'm like, no one is accurate to 5 digits of precision about like fractions of a minute. And so I would use this to just do this. So I found that I was like, well, sometimes I just want to use natural thing. I've spent 2 hours and 29 minutes, or I want to just enter a number and have it rounded. And so I wrote up this little script. And so the thing it does is, since I didn't care about other arguments, and this is just for my own use, I just grab the very last argument from the argument array. I called .2s on it, which converts nil to an empty string, and then call strip on it. So this just fail safes this chain just fail safes to give me a empty string if it's empty, or a value. I then use a regex to see, wait, are you like a number colon another number? Okay, then we're going to say you're this kind of format. Otherwise, and if you are, go ahead and split on that colon and take the first and calculate the number of minutes that this represents. So that's the hours times 60 plus 1.0 times this number is to force it into decimal math. That may not be strictly necessary in Ruby. It's probably a habit I am in from other languages, because technically this 2f does the same thing. And then I calculated minutes, and then I say, okay, else if cast this to 2f, are you greater than 0? And this is just a trick that I used because an empty string 2f is 0. So I'm like, I don't care about that. So then I calculate minutes by multiplying by 60. Show if there's an error, I write to standard error the usage, and I exit with 1 because it exited with an error. And then here I have the output where I guess, okay, I divide by 60 and round to 1, and for good measure to 2. And so then I have, I can be anywhere and type hours, 4 hours and 12 minutes, and be like, oh, that's 4.2 hours. Or I could be like in 35 minutes, and it's like, oh, that's 4.6 hours. That sort of thing. So this is just a quick little tool that's always at my fingertips if I need it. And it's something I was able to code up in plain Ruby like this and use for like the last 7 years or so, I think, without modification. Um, so that's been helpful. Here's another one. When I record these videos, I use OBS Studio, and it writes out to this MKV format. And if I change OBS to say write to MP4, it gives me a warning that like if it crashes, my video is going to be corrupted and kittens are going to cry. And so I'm like, okay, that's fine. Continue to write to MKV. And so then I was like, okay, I can use FFmpeg to convert it. But after about the 5th time Googling how to do this, I'm like, this is stupid. I should just take this and turn this into a Ruby script to do this for me. And so I can just say mkv to mp4 and some file. And so I started this with bash, and then I was like, how do I do a substring replacement in bash? And then I was like Googling, and I'm like, wait, I can use Ruby. I know this. And so then, this basically says, okay, turn this extension into this extension, check about files existing, and fail. Fail's another way to raise an error code. And then build up the command. So I'm like, this is my command with FFmpeg. And then I just, for my own benefit, print it out, and then I actually run it. And notice that the exit here returns whatever system returns. And so that means whatever FFmpeg returns as its error code, this Ruby wrapper will return as its error code. So if I, that's kind of useful to me. So you can also do commands with the backticks, but that returns the textual value, and then you have to remember to use like the underscore question mark parameter to like check the exit code. But if you want the text from the output, that can be a nice way of doing that. It's the same as bash. It's analogous to a subquery in SQL, where you're taking the output of a sub thing and then bringing it into a string. So I showed you the arguments array, but arguments arrays are so 1979. What's really lit is using named parameters. And so Ruby actually has that built in. It has an opt parse, and it has a class called option parser. And so you can say, hey, on -o or -- output, take a file name, and you can do some metadata, and you're like, okay, when you encounter it, do this block. So this is a lambda function, Mera. And so what happens is this whole thing is defined, and then on this line here, I wish I had turned on line numbers, but can you see my mouse arrow moving right there? This line here, so
Yep.
it was a block, and then it's .parse is when it executes. So the block is defined, and then .parse is called on it is when it actually executes. Within this lambda of option parse, you also have this lambda of when it encounters one of these options, it then invokes taking the argument and turning it into this argument. And in this case, out is then set to open this file, and we set this boolean to close file true. The reason I define these initially up here is if I only define them here, the scope would end, and these would actually be garbage collected by the time I got to this line here. So, and even in Ruby, I'll go ahead and define things that I want to survive through the entire runtime of the current lexical scope, or of either the main function or within a function. And so out defaults to standard out. Close file is false because I don't need to close standard out. Option parser does its thing. If it encounters an output file name, it then sets out to open this file that was specified and sets close file to true. At that point, I can then just do out.puts, which will work either way, and out.close if close file will actually close the file. Now Ruby will actually close this file at the end of execution when the Ruby interpreter is shut down. But if you ever then use this code in something other than the Ruby interpreter that ends, you could end up with some dangling file IO handles. So it's nice to clean up your files at the end. And so to give you an example here, /write to file, I run it like this. I can do that. I can also now run it like test.txt, and you'll see nothing. And then, of course, I can also do this, which will see the same thing. So I have now a couple of ways of doing this, including this and bogus. And you'll see it was like, wait, I don't know about this bogus option. So option parser will actually raise an exception for you in that case. Another thing, option parser implements -- help for you. So with that metadata that you've plugged in, it actually will kind of do this usage thing. So that's pretty cool because that's how most programs work. And so all this is built into the standard Ruby library, and you just have to reach to use it. It's not too bad syntax-wise. So how do we read a file from a file or standard in? So you're going to see the same pattern I showed you earlier, where I go ahead and I define a variable input equals standard in. So then I can do input dot gets right down here, right? So close file equals false because I don't need to close standard in. In this case, instead of option, I'm just going to cheat and use argv directly. Same kind of thing though. I reassign input to be the source file that was specified, and I set close file to true, and then I do my business here, right? So I have this loop that just reads line by line and strips it and prints it, and then input.close. In my daily work, I use the example here of a CSV file. I find that I'm often using this pattern when I'm writing some sort of converter. Like I'm going to read this CSV, do something, and write out this other thing. Like maybe I write another CSV, or I write some JSON, or whatever I'm going to do. I'm making a converter. I find that I will do this pattern. And for things that are non-trivial, I'll probably have a class definition up here for like whatever needs to, I guess you would call it a presenter object that takes a line input and writes it into the format that I want. And then you can combine those. And then I can show you read. Did I call it read or file? I think we called it read sample.csv. So you'll see that it can read you can tell I have small children that Dora is in like names are like now my go-to sample data for this kind of stuff. We can do test.text. Maybe I don't have anything to test. Yeah, it's empty. So I mean, obviously this can do any sort of file here. You'll notice here that it's stripping the white space around that. That's because I wrote that in there. That's kind of useful when you are parsing CSV files. And here's a good exercise to the reader. CSV files are often invalid when outputted from other programs, and so you can't just use the standard CSV parser and call it a day, and you definitely can't do .split on the commas. You have to actually write code to interpret them often. So this actually supports all the ways of piping files because it's awesome like that. So that's how you can read from either standard in or standard out. Any questions so far? Cool. So it's printing colors is cool. You can look up the shell color codes, or you can drop in the colorize gem. You do have to gem install this one, but then you can require colorize, and you can take a string and say like this one's .red, this one's green, this one's yellow, and then you'll see on this output like it prints it, and you can also combine them into a string and end up with color codes in your output. So that's super useful when you want to make something easy to read. If we pipe this to a file, let me go back there. Wait, let's pull this up here. So this was colors. So /colors. So that red. So let's write this to text.out. Now we can, you'll notice here that this looks like what you sometimes see if you're running less on your Ruby log file. You'll see these this escape codes are the color codes, the Unix color codes I was telling you about that in the string get interpreted to do colors. Well, here's a trick with less. If you do capital R, it will actually interpret color codes. So when you're scrolling through things, you can see them. So if you didn't know about that, that's a super cool trick with less. So Ruby has there's some progress bar gems. I like progress_bar. So you can drop that in when you're doing something of a long task, and then it will give you a progress bar in your command line that's updating. So this is really good if you're like loading from a database and writing out things or reticulating splines, that sort of thing. And the way it works is when you use this thing, you need to like know some idea of how many steps it is, how many files you're going to process, but usually getting the counts a lot faster than doing the thing. So you do that, you instantiate a progress bar object, then as you go and do your thing, you call bar.increment, and it automatically does this, and it automatically calculates runtime and estimated time remaining for you. So that's a cool trick to throw in. I use this all the time in my long-running rake tasks. It really impresses other developers on my team when they're like getting a progress bar when they're running a long-running rake task. So that's always kind of bonus points. You can do proper object-oriented programming. If you're just going to have a few small classes, you can just throw them in the same file. Because this is Ruby, this isn't Rails, so who cares about their Rails' idea of object structure, models, folders. So you'll see here I have an animal class. It has a speak method that has to be implemented and a pet method that does some stuff. And then on dog and cat both overrode what they said. And so then when I run it, it says the dog says bark and the cat says meow. So it's fetching the class name and doing other Ruby class things. And so you can do that. You do need to require the file that defines if you're going to use multiple files, you do need to require the file that defines the object before you call the object. And so one way to do that is depending, if you're really complicated, you could have like a boot.rb or something in your gem at that point. And have it like loop through the directory, but then depending on the order that things were loaded, it can get messed up. So one thing I think Ruby has a if defined method. So let's see, Ruby defined. So you can check like, hey, if unless defined animal, this class require animal.rb. So what that would do is you could then have that as a thing that's at the top of all the files, or you could have an includes file. And that's how you could get around not having autoloader. Not having autoload. It's really not, it looks weird if you're so used to autoload, but honestly, as a developer, I prefer the explicitness of it personally, because I know exactly what it's loading and when. And the final little bit is if your script uses a lot of gems, you'll probably want to make a gem file and use bundler. So, I mean, of course you can do that. It's just like anything else when it installs them in your high level. If it's even more complicated and you want to make it a gem, that's beyond the scope of this conversation, but you can make a gem. And then in 2012, I actually made a gem. It's actually probably one of the few I've made. It's a command line tool called get_time extractor that like reads through the get commit history and uses the deltas of timestamps to compute a probable timesheet per developer for the work that was done. Is thrown off by squash merges, but I've used this for tax purposes. I've used this for other things that have called for timesheets that weren't contemporaneously kept, and the output of the tool, because it's based on data, was acceptable for those legal situations where, for legal reasons, a timesheet was highly desired. Um, and then the nice thing, once you make a gem, you can either make it local. If you choose to publish it to Ruby Gems, you get the added benefit that you can just install it anytime you want on any of your computers because it's publicly available, including to you. And you can just go get gem install time, get time extractor, and then get time extract to your heart's content. And so let me see if I have projects active. Sorry. CD GitHub. Let's look at carrier wave. Ah. So you see the gem did its thing. Get time extractor. It does have some commands to do different things. And then I can open up time.csv. We should drag this over here. And yeah, I think those are treated as proper dates. So then what I can do now that I have it in a spreadsheet is autofilter pivot table. And let's go with week and hours. No, let's go with person. So you're starting to see you can take that data and then use just a spreadsheet to start to get things that for some accounting reason, project management reason, might be useful. So that's a Ruby gem that I wrote. You can check out the source code. If it's useful, get time extractor. If it's useful, you could do a pull request to add some feature. I would say the automated test coverage is not as high as I'd like it now, but it works, and it's been around for a while now. So that, with the conclusion, I would say Ruby is an extremely powerful scripting language with a large standard library and tons of gems at your disposal. It's awesome. Who doesn't love Ruby amongst us? There's actually a book that's been written on building command line. This is the older edition. There was a newer edition on Ruby 2. This covers some gems. Some of them you may want to use. It makes like parsing options and other things that I did not touch on. I have personally kind of stuck to just using option parse because it's default. It's part of the standard library. So that to me is of some benefit. And then now you know how to make your own Ruby command line apps. So any questions? You're like, this is crazy talk. Or
I think
Frank,
it's the rich standard library that really makes it a good candidate for a command line tool.
oh yeah, you can do, I mean, anything, right? I mean, anything you can code in Ruby, you can make into a tool. Designing great command line interfaces, is a more advanced topic than just this intro. But you can do a lot with just some simple scripts that take your parameters and do something useful.
Frank, do you know of any good way to create a more of a user interface within the terminal? Something similar to like what HTOP does, where you have a bar at the top with some static and dynamic data.
So basically incurses. I'm sure that works. I have not honestly done it. Let's look this up. Ruby incurses. Look! I have not used this, but technically, historically, curses would be what you're looking for.
Cool.
And there appears to be a wrapper for it. This was formerly part of the Ruby standard library. Well, that sucks. Why is it not part of it now?
Well, it looks like it's still relatively maintained, so that's not a bad thing,
No, not at all.
maybe. Yeah, I've written some command line interactive apps that have like a little menu system, and I just kind of cheapen and do a system clear when it goes to another menu. And I made some tools for managing my Kubernetes environments where I can do context switching, log a certain pod, and all that stuff. So Ruby's super powerful.
Oh yeah, reminds me a lot of some of my batch DOS 5 batch menu systems I made for fun back in the day. You'd like the menu would print and you'd have to like enter the number of the option that you wanted and then it would switch to the next screen, that sort of thing. That was some of my first Nick, you gestured as if you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I'm curious. So, are there any particular resources that sort of collect a heap of these different Ruby command line tools, or do you have a repo that sort of where you can show off sort of all the ones that you've created? Or
I don't have a public repo. My bin folder does have a Git repository in it. I have mostly done this just for my own. But that's a great question and makes me think I really could share more of these publicly. I have probably made a few gists from time to time of something I found very useful that I thought someone else might benefit from, but I don't think I've been very consistent about it. But thank you. Was that the question? Did I understand it correctly?
yeah. That was the question. It did make me realize one of the things that I built in command line using Ruby was just to get the latest version of a language from ASDF, because I was sort of, oh, well, there are times when it's just, if I'm setting up a new computer, I just want, well, whatever the latest is, rather than me having to manually, this talk reminded me, oh yeah, I built that.
That's very cool. I'll show you some of my other, this is slightly unrelated. Get, I do a lot of get aliases. So, for example, I have latest to get me the latest branches that were most recently touched, swap to swap between one branch and the last. So there's some things I do by get alias, and then there's a lot of get stuff that I also do by creating a wrapper script. So if I go to bin, let's see, get author stats, this is a bash script, but I was like, I got tired of figuring out how to do this. So I did a get log, grep author, sort, do this stuff, then loop through it and do this other stuff. I might have gotten some of that from online. There's a few. Get purge. Get stuff is really ripe for turning into shell scripts, because who the hell can remember these invocations sometimes? I guess that's the point. Nelson.
So I have a question. Yeah. When you have a require statement and you're requiring a library, if someone doesn't have the library installed, it errors out. but could you automatically install the required gems,
Ooh.
like from the like launch it with a bash script first and then see if the requirements are met?
Yes. It's called Bundler Inline, which basically when you run the script, it'll first run a bundle install on a inline gem file block that you create. So it'll install all the gems first, and then it'll execute your script. It's a lot slower, but it does do that.
Yeah. Another thing that is related but not is when you are doing this stuff, you're often shelling out to other Unix programs. And sometimes that could even be in like a worker thing, but maybe it's a native program that you shell out to. I like to add some code that checks to see if that command exists, and if it doesn't, raise an exception. Otherwise, you sometimes end up in some really bizarre I thought it works, but it didn't work edge cases because it errored out and you didn't handle that. So that's a related thing about the native dependency not being present. And I did not actually know about bundler inline, so I just wrote that down. Thanks, Dave. Do, 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 do.
Does bundler ship with every Ruby now?
If not, you can gem install bundler.
Right, but I mean that. I was just thinking, you have a chicken and an egg there.
Yeah, you do. So we could check something. Gem remove, colorize. Was it gem uninstall? I never remember this. Let me hop back over to this one. So colors should fail, right? Oh, I'm different gem file. Gem uninstall, colorize. Okay, so this just failed, right? Okay. So let's try this out. I'm not saying this would be the way to do it. This is pretty ugly.
So doesn't the bundler inline accomplish this?
It may, and but the question was asked, but don't you have to install bundler first? Which may be something. I just want to see if this even. Oh, I guess require failure is not captured by the try block. It's probably a lower level thing. So let's assume we have this. Dave, help me out. Bundler inline syntax.
I just put it in the comments, so you should just be able to copy and paste it.
Yeah, let's
And then put the gem in there for you too.
Cool. So we're going to grab this, pop that in here. So this is going to require bundler inline. So we do have that chicken egg problem. We need bundler. And then we have this inline gem file. And so now we should be able to do colors. Well, that's interesting. I guess I still need to require.
Oh, because you put
colorize.
require false on colorize in the gem file.
Yeah, it's commented out.
I had removed this.
Yeah,
So-
and in the gem file block, they said require falses. They're on the.
So if I take that out, I don't need this.
Yeah, and so it looks like Bundler is part of the standard library since 2.6. So as long as you're using a recent Ruby, that will work.
Ta-da! There you go. The power of the community. I love it. Thank you. So you
It's
can do it
funny.
this way.
You can also find people who have posted an entire Ruby on Rails application in a single file where they do this bundler in mind, but then they also have like the whole active support and everything in there in a single file. It's kind of crazy.
That does sound crazy. I love this approach. I really do. This is super useful.
My prior C used to check, like, there's a bunch of pry add-ons that I really like. And yeah, I'd hacked together like a convoluted check if these various gems are installed and then require them if available. But yeah, it looks like this will make things yeah, much smoother. Yeah, bundle inline looks really cool.
And I mean, it loaded in what? Not very many milliseconds. So that's pretty cool.
Well, and in theory, it only really has to install the gem
Once per
once,
gem
and
set.
yeah, and then yeah, that's very cool.
Anything else? You better get to the kiddos, Dave. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll see y'all later.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, Dave.
Well, that's all.
This is wonderful, Frank. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, it's a lot easier than you think. And the approach I take, I like to try to have very minimum third-party library, because when I'm writing these up, I'm trying to stick with functionality that I can recall off the top of my head, because I'm trying to take something that I would have otherwise done manually, copying and pasting from like a run book in a README file or something, and turning it into scripted commands instead. Of course, when you're doing actual development, you would spend more time like TDD and objects and other things. So you just have to use wisdom to know when what you're writing is starting to graduate from being a script to being more of a program. And, there's a very fine line between those. And I'm going to stop the recording.